All right, students, this is Mr. S, and today I've got retired detective with Miami-Dade Police, Jeffrey Lewis, who's going to be speaking with us about his experience in law enforcement, including his time working as a homicide investigator in the Miami, Florida area. Jeff, thanks for taking some time to speak with us today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
I've just got a few questions I want to run down just to kind of glean from your experience in the field to be able to share with the criminal justice students in my class. Tell us, if you don't mind, how you got your start in the law enforcement career field.
I developed an interest in law enforcement actually when I was growing up. Had a couple neighbors that were police officers. My father was a reserve police officer in Columbus, Ohio. So I became interested through them, and then when I graduated high school, I decided to pursue it through the United States Air Force, where I enlisted and was in the Air Force as a Special Forces Security Police law enforcement type officer for 4 years. And upon being discharged from the Air Force, I was fortunate enough to be hired by the Miami-Dade Police Department in 1980.
Okay, and tell us, if you don't mind, we've got several students with our university that are either active or reserve military. So, how exactly did you make the transition from the military side of law enforcement and the military in general as well into civilian law enforcement?
Basically, it was very simple, because whether you're a military police officer or a civilian police officer, the bottom line is you're dealing with people. And as long as you can do that, that transition is easy from one to the other. And actually, I know I work with guys that continue to stay in the military in a reserve status as police officers while they were on the Miami-Dade Police Department. So it was an easy transition on both sides.
And is that true for the non-military police job fields as well? The different MOSs?
I would say so. Basically, law enforcement entails the ability to communicate. And no matter where you're coming from, if you decide this is what you want to do at that point, as long as you can talk to people and get along with people and communicate, you'll do fine.
Okay. If I was to take a survey among my criminal justice students over the past 15 years that I've been teaching, probably the two most popular career field aspirations are crime scene and homicide investigation. So if you would, how exactly did you transition your career once you got into law enforcement into ultimately getting into the homicide investigation field?
It was a slow transition. You know, you get on a police department, initially you're required to be a uniform officer. And I was a uniform officer for approximately a year and a half. And from there, I went to we had a street crimes unit in the Liberty City area of Miami. So I joined the street crimes unit. And from there, after about a year or so, I was recruited to be a robbery detective. I became a robbery detective for approximately 14 years, and I loved being a robbery detective. And I saw a lot of my partners go over to the homicide section, including one of my old sergeants. So after a while, they kept asking me if I wanted to be a homicide detective, and after 14 years of being a robbery detective, there weren't really any more kinds of robberies that I could investigate that I hadn't already investigated, so I decided to become a homicide detective, and I was fortunate enough to be selected to become one.
Okay. And if you were speaking to a class full of criminal justice students now, what would you tell them as far as things that they could consider doing now, in addition to finishing their degree, that might help them to ultimately be successful in joining law enforcement as a career field, and even eventually going into the homicide investigation field?
There's a couple things you can do. Number one, what you might want to do is check with your local police department and see if they have ride-alongs. If they do, I would definitely suggest that you do that. Ride different shifts, different areas of the city. Ride a midnight shift, ride an afternoon shift, ride a day shift. That way you get a different flavor of of each shift, because believe me, each shift is different. Um, if they have, some departments have civilian classes where you can join up, and they'll run you through what it takes to be a police officer within their police department. They may take you to the range. They may teach you defensive driving. It's basically a way of communicating with the civilians and letting them know what the police department actually does. So if you can do that, that might not be a bad idea. And one of the last things that I would suggest you do is with today's media, there are plenty of television shows that portray real life police officers and detectives. First 48, the Investigation Discovery Channel, Forensic Files. I would have loved to have had those shows when I was a detective, because even today when I watch Forensic Files, I see something that I might have been able to utilize as a homicide detective back in my day. But if you do those things, I think it'll open up your eyes, and it'll basically let you know if that's the field you actually want to go into, as far as like being sworn in and being an actual police officer.
Okay. And that second recommendation you made, that's like your Citizens Academies, right?
Citizens Academy, absolutely. If they have one, do it. It's not going to hurt you. You're going to learn what's going on, and also you're going to meet the people within the police department. And if that's the department you want to work for down the road, and you go in there and you show the aptitude and good standing, then they're going to recruit you. So you get a step ahead on the other people that may not partake in that type of surrounding.
Okay. And sometimes there's also opportunities for those that are in college to do internships. Is that something that's popularly seen in your area as well?
It was. Actually, we had students from Florida State University, University of Florida, University of Miami that would do internships within our department. So most major departments probably have that through the summer. So if you can do that, definitely take advantage of that situation.
Okay. And you had provided to us some photographs and a narrative write-up of a case that you had worked that entailed where some physical evidence really kind of helped to make or break the case. If you don't mind, in addition to the write-up that you provided, what briefly, thinking back on that case, comes to mind as far as how the physical evidence in that case really helped to make that case to where it was able to be successfully convicted?
In this particular case, it was the only piece of physical evidence that I had. Normally, in a shooting homicide, you have a bullet, you may have a shell casing, you may have fingerprints, you may have surveillance camera evidence, you have blood on the scene from your offender. So there's a lot of possibilities when you arrive on the scene. A lot of that changes when your scene is outside, which this case was an outside case. But basically, when I got there and reviewed my scene along with my crime scene investigator and the other detectives, we realized we didn't have any of that evidence. We didn't have anything until we started actually processing the scene. And at that point in time, that's where I discovered a gold cap that you would apply to your tooth, or to a tooth. And that was the only piece of physical evidence that we had on that scene at that time.
Okay. And you mentioned a moment ago that when you were working that scene, you were speaking with and working in collaboration with your crime scene investigator. And a lot of times in the media, crime scene investigation is depicted very differently than how it actually works in the real world. So from your experience, how exactly do homicide investigators and crime scene investigators or technicians, how do they work together, and how are those jobs different?
Basically, you have to work hand in hand with the crime scene technicians when they arrive on the scene. And with our department, we worked in what we called a team concept. The lead investigator, depending on what's going on, would assign one of the detectives to the crime scene, one of the detectives to do an area canvass, one of the detectives to interview any witnesses, and if you've got somebody in custody, the lead detective would go back to the office and interview the perpetrator. If you do not have a perpetrator and you don't have a lot going on, then the lead detective will usually process the scene with the crime scene investigator. When I mean process the scene, he'll walk the crime scene investigator through the scene and advise them as to what he's looking for, what I was looking for, and direct them to process it, photograph it, collect it, and do that type of thing.
Okay.
So basically, as the lead homicide detective, you run your scene, they process it for you.
Exactly. And the processing would entail the full documentation of the scene of photographs, sketch.
Collecting any blood, any
Exactly.
evidence, any physical evidence. It's a tedious job, and you rely on those guys because they may find something you don't see because they may be used to looking for something that you're not used to looking for. So they may see something, find a location where there may be evidence, a fingerprint, some blood that you didn't think to look at, or something like that. So they're important to you not only on the scene, down the road when you start developing other evidence and you confer with them, and then of course if you make an arrest in court, their testimony is very important.
Exactly. Now, with criminal justice students really running the full spectrum as far as where their interest lies in the career field, occasionally there's students who are not interested in the sworn positions, but more in the support roles within a law enforcement agency. And with a large agency like your own, what type of support opportunities are typically available for those who may want to pursue an opportunity other than sworn officer positions?
There are some various other opportunities. Number one, you could be a fingerprint examiner. And that's all you do. You examine the latent fingerprints that come into the office from crime scenes. You could be a DNA / blood spatter examiner where you'll test all the blood that comes in, all the fibers that may come in, anything that has any kind of physical evidence that may be excreted by the human body. You'll examine that. If there's a bloody scene, they may call you out to the scene, and you'll do your blood spatter investigation where you'll actually take your strings and you'll string it up to the blood, and you'll tell which direction the blood was flying, and if somebody was using a hammer, where did the spatter go, which is very interesting. You could be a firearms examiner. Examine the shell casings and the weapons that are impounded. That also entails tool mark identification, glass identification, paint identification. Let's say a hit and run, you get paint scrapings from a car transferred from one vehicle to another. So that'll keep you kind of busy. That's kind of interesting. Polygraph examiner. Give polygraphs to individuals that are under investigation, that are being interviewed. Those are a sketch artist. A lot of departments now kind of use a computer for that, but still a sketch artist is another thing you might want to consider. So those are some different avenues you can take to work with the police department and provide major support for the detectives and the uniform officers and everybody else. Those are all important roles.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned before that when you got your initial role in the investigative field, that you had started out working robbery investigations. From your personal experience, what makes the investigation of homicide cases different from the investigation of other types of crimes?
Well, basically, a homicide investigation, you may not have a live witness. If, like in the case that we were talking about previously, I had a victim, deceased, who wasn't able to describe what had happened to him, wasn't able to help us in any way at all. Whereas if he would have been the victim of a robbery, which that case was, but survived it, he can give you a description. He can tell you what happened. He may know the person that robbed him. That type of information you can get from your victim. So that's the main point. The other differences is, number one, you're not going to handle as many homicides as you would robberies. And a homicide investigation is I don't want to say it's more serious, but it's looked at a little bit harder by your prosecutors, by your defense attorneys, by your judges. A lot of those cases, if they go up on appeal, you're going to have circuit court judges, you're going to have appeal court judges. Sometimes the case could even go to the Supreme Court, but it's going to be reviewed because it's a homicide. You may have death penalty cases. Down in Florida, we have the death penalty. So there's a little bit of a higher standard assigned to investigating those cases, plus just dealing with the families. I mean, there's nothing more difficult than handling a homicide case, and at 4 in the morning, you have to go knock on somebody's door and let them know that somebody in their family's been murdered. I mean, that's especially if it's a father or a mother or a child, no matter what the circumstances are. It's very difficult to do that. You don't have to do that in any other investigation in the police department. That's specific to homicide detectives. Plus, homicide detectives handle not only homicides, but they handle natural deaths, where you don't have a doctor to sign off on the death certificate, accidental death, which could be electrocution, a tree falls on you, a car falls on you while you're working underneath it, sicknesses, so there's suicides. So there's a variety of death that you handle as a homicide investigator that you wouldn't handle in any other field in the department. Then it's very interesting, and everybody loves to talk to a homicide detective.
And would you say, because you mentioned that there's oftentimes a higher standard because you're dealing with, the death of an individual, that things may go beyond just the circuit or district court. They may go, to an appellate court. It may go to a Supreme Court. Because of that higher standard, would you say that it's of the utmost importance for those that are interested in that being a career aspiration to ensure that as they get into investigative roles, that they diligently fine tune the quality of their work, the quality of their report writing, the quality of their processing of a scene, and all of those investigative steps, because the bar is, as you mentioned, so high?
Absolutely. That's why I would recommend that before you become a homicide detective, be a burglary detective, be a robbery detective, be an auto theft detective, credit card theft, any kind of detective work that you can do prior to becoming a homicide detective, do it. Hone your skills, learn how to interview and interrogate, learn what to look for in a crime scene, learn how to talk to your witnesses, to your victims in these other cases, communication, and writing a report, because that report is what you would put your name on. That report is what is read by everybody. And a homicide report could be 300 pages long. A robbery report could be 2 pages long. A burglary report could be 1 page long. So those are the differences that you have to use to distinguish between the homicide job and any other detective within the police department.
Great point. From your personal experience, what made well, let me rephrase that. If you could go back to speak to your rookie self when you were a rookie officer, with what you've done and learned in your law enforcement career, what kind of advice might you offer yourself that might also be of benefit to criminal justice students that are looking at this as a possible career aspiration?
I probably would have kept a lot more of my arrest forms and my reports, tried to maybe document what I did as a uniform officer. And of course, nowadays you can do that a lot easier than you could when I was working. Just to keep a historical record of what I did. Because not only after you retire do you want to review that, but as you're transitioning from uniform to whatever detective unit you go to or whatever, that information that you have, sometimes you can go back and refer to. Let's say you worked a certain area and you arrested a bunch of individuals in that area. Now you're working robbery, and that's part of your area. Well, guess what? Now you've got that documentation. You're a step ahead of the game. Things like that you might want to do just to help yourself down the road.
Absolutely. And a lot of the people that you deal with on the street on a day-to-day basis in a patrol situation, perhaps if you look at it beyond just, well, this is a simple arrest, but you actually try to develop some rapport with them, you might develop a source that as you become an investigator may be someone who is willing to talk to you and wouldn't another detective.
Absolutely. listen, anytime you're out on the street, you always try to get yourself a source,
Yeah.
no matter what function you're in, because that's your bread and butter. And actually, that's one of the things that I was able to do very well. Even to this day, old sources that I had contact me and still tell me about crimes that are going on, and I've been gone almost 5 years now. So it's something that if you can develop good sources, and then what you do, in my case, I passed on my sources to the current detectives that are working. And that's a bread and butter, especially as a homicide detective.
Absolutely. Well, Detective Lewis, we thank you for your time today, and we thank you for the information you shared on that case study as well. And happy holidays to you.
Thank you, and I really appreciate it, and good luck, everybody.